To the casual observer, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, or UFC, may come across as little more than modern gladiatorial combat. However, a closer look will reveal that the mixed martial arts tournament that began in 1993 is far more complex and regulated. UFC meet EPS on this episode of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. Professor Dan Hipp is a neuroscientist as well as a practitioner of jujitsu. I was happy to have him appear on my program again, this time to discuss how the first Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC 1, acts as not only a document of the early 1990s, but also how it marks the start of a revolution in spectator pugilism. Back to the EPS podcast where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and I'm joined, just like I was last season, by a good friend of mine, Professor Dan Hipp, who is a neuroscientist and black belt, right?
No, not a black belt, purple belt.
Purple belt, and in jujitsu. And that is, we're going to kind of combine the two. Last time we talked about commando. We tapped into your background in education and what you've researched to talk about a 1985 Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. And now we are going into something that it really does affect the brain. I imagine some of those UFC fights. We're going to be talking about UFC 1, the original from 1993, right? And would you say that UFC contributed to your interest in martial arts?
Oh my God, man. Well, first, it's good to be here and to see you again, my old friend. I can't tell you how much the early UFC. Oh, I guess I can. That's why I'm here.
Yeah. Please do.
Yes. In fact, you. Yeah. So, I mean, let's just get right into it, right? What was UFC 1? UFC 1 was kind of every 1990s teenager or young kids who watched the Ninja Turtles or played Street Fighter. It was like our wet dream. We got to finally find out which martial arts style was the toughest. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't something to which we had access before that. We can talk about all the variations of this format that occurred throughout the world, in Japan especially, and all the different martial arts that went into it. But really, what we were in the early 90s, every young kid who liked fighting or wrestling or martial arts or whatever wanted to know who could win in a fight.
Yeah.
Mike Tyson or Hulk Hogan or whatever the discussion was for each group.
Some kind of crossover.
Yeah, and that's what UFC 1 proffered us. It gave us an opportunity to see, which was the martial art style that in one-to-one combat with no rules would reign supreme.
And we got watching it and you get the idea that, I mean, a lot of the format of the actual fight had to be created just for UFC, like the shape of the ring and like the chain link fence around it and stuff. I guess they even wanted to put like a barbed wire fence, but they're like, no, that's a little bit too far. But it's like, but the fighters seem like they're familiar with it already. Like, what were a lot of those guys doing before they came to Denver? You would think something like that would be in Las Vegas, but it was in Denver, Colorado. What were they doing to not necessarily even train for this, but like honing their particular skills? Like, how were they fighting other, people not from their particular discipline?
Yeah. So it's part of kind of the mythos of UFC. Is that it was, people think it was the first opportunity these people had to fight each other. And that's not the case. There have been, so Japan actually it had a few different organizations that had similar fights to what the UFC put on. It's just, they weren't popular here. Right. So you have to think, this is pre-internet. This is the era of the video store. And the way most of us found out about UFC 1, although it was picked up on pay-per-view and a lot of people watched it on pay-per-view, most of us walked into a Blockbuster Video or even your local video store. For me, it was Hi-Ho Video in Levittown, New York. And you'd walk over to the somewhat shady section, but not the nudie section, just the somewhat shady section.
The mature section.
The mature section.
Not the triple X section.
Which is where all 9-year-olds should go. And and that's where we found out about it. But there were other, to your point, there were other competitions. There was something called Pancrase. Pancrase, it was an organization, and I believe they were organized out of Japan. I know their fights were out of Japan, and they were meant to simulate the old Pancratian style of fighting. Pancration is really an ancient Olympic style of fighting. It involves wrestling and striking and all these things put together, just as modern mixed martial arts does, although obviously in a less refined way. And there were Pancration fights for a while before this. In fact, Ken Shamrock, who competed in this first UFC, was a Pancration fighter out of Japan and talked about it during the interviews given in between the matches.
Yeah.
And so the novelty of UFC 1 was not that it was the first ever competition put together with mixed competitors and with few rules. The novelty was that really there was no rules. That was a novelty. And the novelty was that it was being brought to an American audience.
Right.
And this answers your second question of why was it in Denver? It's because no one else would hold it.
Right.
Denver is, I live in Denver now. So I'm not some native Denverite, but, Denver has this kind of libertarian streak to it. They're going to do what they want. And this style of fight wasn't able to be put on anywhere else, because nowhere else would sanction it.
Right.
Whereas Denver's like, we'll let you do it.
Yeah, because I was doing a little bit of research before this. It seemed like that at that time there wasn't really any like sports commission in Colorado, so there weren't regulations and rules and on being able to have a fight like that. And when you watch the first match of it, it doesn't last very long, and it's like the first time, you almost see the audience and the announcers, when he kicks him in the head, they're like, oh yeah, he could do that. Like the referee is almost as useful as a American Gladiators referee, which was a show that was super popular in the same time period. So it was like we were hedging in that direction, but and WWF, WWE, I forget when it changed its name, but that was on its way out a little bit in the late 80s, early 90s. People making accusations of it's fake. And I remember watching mid 90s or so documentaries about WWF, and the guys be like, it's not fake, and we get really hurt in there. But it's like, yeah, but it doesn't quite, with all the theatrics behind it, it doesn't have the same rawness that I think the audiences were really kind of hoping for. Yes. And so you enter into the world of UFC, and it's like, oh yeah, that actually is kind of what the society was clamoring for a long time.
Absolutely. And this is this says something about WWF at that time, is to your point. So WWF was, I was real big into it when I was a little kid. And WWF, it wasn't, I wouldn't agree with you that it was diminishing, but what it was doing was transitioning, to your point, from a point where people thought it was real to where people knew it was fake and liked it anyway.
Yeah.
And that's a big transition. When I was growing up, the toughest guys were the wrestlers, and the boxers. It was the heavyweight champion of the world in WWF, and it was the heavyweight champion of the world in boxing. Those were the toughest guys around. And as things got more soap opera-ish in WWF, and as the, so to speak, fakeness became more obvious, I feel like people were clamoring much more for a product that they could sink their teeth into that was real. And there was nothing realer than the original UFC in that regard, especially for the time period. As you said, the first match was a 6'5" Dutch kickboxer against a 410-pound Polynesian sumo wrestler.
who the kickboxer just kind of wearing like sweats, like
He's just wearing a
it looks like that anyway. He looks like he just kind of like rolled out of bed and he's like, all right, like, I'll get to fighting any minute now, or however you say it in Dutch. But
and the sumo wrestler is wearing his traditional outfit,
right,
and they stalk each other for about 10 seconds. The sumo wrestler sprints in and tries to take big boy the kickboxer down, falls on his ass, gets kicked in the face, and there's this iconic screenshot from the first UFC where you see the sumo wrestler Taylor Tui, you see his tooth flying out of his mouth.
Yeah.
And it's flying into the crowd. And that's kind of when even the announcer said, once we saw that tooth come out, we knew this was serious.
Right. I'm sure the promoters, the makers of it, like, perfect. You know, within seconds of this starting, we already have what we're looking for.
And so the promoters of it, this is and this will be a story well known to anybody who's into the jiu-jitsu community, but a lot of people don't understand this if they're just casual UFC fans. The first UFC was put on by the Gracie family.
Mm-hmm.
So Royce Gracie ended up winning UFC 1. He was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. He was kind of an average looking dude, and he went in there and he choked everybody. Choke. And the matches weren't very close. And right before the final match, Royce Gracie's brother and father come out, and they do this long monologue where the brother Rorion Gracie is presenting a commemorative plaque to his father, Helio Gracie, the guy who invented jiu-jitsu.
Oh, wow.
So in a sense, now he invented Gracie Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Right.
It came from judo, which came from Japanese jiu-jitsu. So there is this long lineage. But the person who transitioned it into a proper ground fighting art was Helio Gracie. And his son comes out and gives him a plaque. And what you realize at that moment is actually UFC 1 isn't just some randomly strung together group of fighters. UFC 1 is a commercial of sorts for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to introduce to American audiences this new, highly dominant martial art so that this family who had invented it could promulgate their art and make a lot of money off of it. And indeed they did. Now it's one of the most popular martial arts in the world. I've been training in it for 15 years and in similar arts. And, it's one of those things where without that the first cause, this first UFC, it's not clear that jiu-jitsu would have ever caught on. It's not fun to watch per se. There's not a lot of flashy kicks or techniques. It really is just closing the distance with your opponent, dragging them to the mat, and applying either a joint lock or a chokehold to make them give up.
Yeah.
And it turns out that's the best way to kick the shit out of somebody if there's no rules and no time limits.
I was going to ask, because I mean, it's pretty obvious where boxing came from. It started people, and in the early, at least in this country, the early boxing matches were usually held in tavern back rooms and saloons and stuff like that. And it was bare knuckle, 25 rounds and then it got more refined, quote unquote, by as the century went on. There was gloves put on the guys and rules and everything like that. And I assume that came from just centuries of people defending themselves with clenched fists. And when it comes to something like jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, was it developed as an actual self-defense technique, or was it more for the conditioning and the the methodology and the philosophies that come behind it? And because when you go into a martial arts studio, it's not just a bunch of guys. It's not like a boxing gym where people are just practicing. There's a lot, almost like a spiritualism next to it, and some all that kind of layered to it, a little bit more Easternism involved. I know I asked a lot of questions there, but was it actually developed as a way to, as I'm walking down the street, if somebody gave me a hard time, I could just put them into some kind of chokehold?
Yeah, it was 100% designed for that first reason, to beat the shit out of people. To beat people in a fist fight. in fact, purposely bucked a lot of the sort of Eastern mysticism and so forth that you speak about. The idea, I mean, look, in jujitsu, when you get on the mats, you bow to get on the mats as a courtesy to the mats and the people that are on there. And you do often line up in the beginning of class. There is a belt hierarchy. So there is some remnants of kind of the traditional hierarchical structure of judo and karate and all these other things, right? But what makes jujitsu unique and what made it what promoted it so well early in Brazil was the fact that it could defeat all comers. And so really there were two competing arts in Brazil when jiu-jitsu was coming up. There was jiu-jitsu, which was really the Gracie family and the people who studied with them. And it turns out the guy who won the first UFC wasn't even the toughest Gracie. He was not even his toughest brother. Royce was not nearly as good at jiu-jitsu or as athletic or strong looking as his brother Rickson, who never lost a match. He competed in lots of mixed martial arts style fights, and he was really, really, really an amazing character in his own right. But no, so what turned jiu-jitsu into something they wanted to export to America to make a lot of money with was they would do these gym challenges. They had an open challenge in Brazil. If you think your martial art's better than ours, let's fight. And they would go around if they heard, and this was, back in the day, so there were fewer rules, and we're talking Brazil, so fewer rules still.
Right.
What they would do is they would go to, if they heard there was this karate guy down the street who was talking a lot of smack and saying, my martial art's the best, they would go there with their brothers. They'd walk in and they say, who's the owner of this gym? Who's the toughest guy here? And they challenge him to a no rules fist fight. And invariably they would videotape it. And they actually sold this. It was called Gracie in Action. They would sell these fights. You can go watch them on YouTube. You can watch them fighting these karate masters and so forth, with the brother who started the first UFC narrating over the other brother beating the piss out of him. And explain, now he's going to close the distance, and now he's going to take him down. This is jiu-jitsu in action, right? And that's what they would do. They would go in and they would whoop on these people. Because it's one thing in the modern day to say jiu-jitsu isn't the best art for like UFC now. And it's true, there's not a lot of pure jiu-jitsu guys who win titles right now. They have to know a little bit of everything. They have to be good wrestlers, good strikers. They have to be well-conditioned athletes. But in the absence of any ground fighting knowledge, there's no chance of surviving against somebody who's a grappler who's grabbed a hold of you if you don't know anything about grappling. Right. It just can't happen. And that makes it different from something like kickboxing. If you get a 300-pound bodybuilder and he goes in there against a big kickboxer, the kickboxer is probably going to piece him up, right? He's going to kick him in the legs, punch him in the face, and not get hit a lot. But there's always that chance of this big brute knocking the hell out of you, right? With a big overhand haymaker that you don't see coming. It was too fast. Well, it's tough to do that in grappling arts. Obviously, there are limits, but if you grab a hold of somebody and they don't know any grappling, you're probably going to be able to choke them unconscious, or to break one of their bones, or do whatever, or just hold them in place, which actually was the first example in UFC 1 of how jiu-jitsu won. Really, what happened was the first time Royce Gracie got in the cage, he went against Art Jimerson, a top 10 boxer from America, like a serious dude. He was a serious boxer. Got in there about 30 seconds into the match. Royce takes him down, gets on top of him, full mount. So that means the opponent's legs are not engaged in the act at all. And Royce is just sitting there on top, no submission hold applied, and the other guy taps out. He has no idea what to do. And that was like eye-opening. Like, wow, this guy just did that in like 45 seconds.
What's wild is that
champion fighter.
It's like, and it seems like, so up until like a few minutes ago, I just heard the name jiu-jitsu and it sounds like ancient. It sounds like it's from, centuries ago. And what's crazy is it seems like, and it's not even just gradual or kind of happenstance, that it seems purposeful. They're like out with the old, in with the new. right? Like they're actually saying like all of these old ancient, fighting styles, they're no good. We're going to take our brand new thing and introduce it in more ways than one. Like, so using modern technology like video cameras, because it'd be one thing just to be like afterwards, like, oh yeah, see that karate guy down the way? Like we took out him in his own studio. It's like, no, we actually have handheld video of it. And then with, talk about like a boxer, like we said before, that was like the classic. I mean, think about how many, boxing matches have been going on for, since the TV age. And then on top of it, and I wanted to actually mention this before, and I think it adds to sort of the intrigue of it, is that the pay-per-view component really ups the ante as far as, wow, they can't just show it on TV. Like you have to pay for it. And that's what WWF used to be like. And I think that that's what added to the excitement of WWF. Because I remember that was part of the reason I never really got into it, is because, we couldn't afford to like call, you had to call a certain number and then like turn off the channel and then turn back on. And like some of my neighbors did sometimes. So I'd be able to watch, the SummerSlam or, all the different events. But I think that by the early 90s, WWF had become a little bit more mainstream, and you could catch it on, I don't know if it's quite that early, but like eventually I think TNT had it, and, the TBS or whatever, and they would show these things. Whereas like, okay, that's getting kind of, pedestrian. Let's have this brand new, fighting style. And it's going to be so intense that we can't just put it on cable. You have to pay even more money than your cable bill just to watch this thing. So talk about the modern era just sweeping in and taking, grappling, the past. And that seems to be pretty consistent with a lot of the 90s, doesn't it? I mean, but they'd been started a long time before the 90s developing this martial arts style.
Absolutely. So you're quite right that jujitsu sounds ancient, because it is ancient, actually. Japanese jujitsu is probably the progenitor art. And from that came judo. Judo is an amazing martial art. It's still super useful these days. And it's quite similar, actually, to Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So what happened was the father of Royce Gracie, who won UFC 1, his name's Helio Gracie, and he learned judo from a Japanese master. And this is how the story goes anyway. Helio said, well, judo's great. And he became an expert in it and was very happy to have learned it, but realized that many of the moves were better suited for larger opponents. And he had difficulty employing those moves against larger opponents because he was a man of smaller frame. Mm. And so what Brazilian jiu-jitsu was, at first, it was the adaptation of moves from judo with some elaboration to make them suitable for small people to defeat larger people.
Oh, okay.
And that's what it was. So it still works when you're big, but if you're small and you know jiu-jitsu, you're at an advantage relative to if you had known other martial arts, because it's specifically designed to use, as I put it, physics over biology.
I see.
To use things like leverage, momentum, and other principles to overcome a larger opponent. Now, all martial arts say these sorts of things,
right?
To your point. But the difference in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and compared to things like Aikido and so forth is that there's no videotapes of Aikido masters going into local martial arts tough guy gyms and beating them up, because they can't. Right. Because things like Aikido don't work to defeat opponents. They work to bring people in and to trick people into thinking they're learning something effective. That's what something like Aikido works for. Something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu really works to defeat a resisting opponent. And part of it is built into the training style. When I go, I'm going in an hour and a half right now. I'm going to train. When you go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to train, you don't go and do your forms Like, you don't do your katas, as they might say in like karate. You don't work with somebody who's not resisting. Most of your training is done with at least a partially resisting opponent. Yeah. And when you spar, the cool thing about jiu-jitsu is you can go 100% without worrying about hurting your opponent, because there's a mechanism to get out at any time if you're being hurt, and it's called tapping out.
Right.
And that differentiates it from basically everything except judo before it. Another big difference between judo and jiu-jitsu is the time limit format. Jiu-jitsu has no, the original way it was constructed to work in a no time limit scenario. So, which is very different from judo, which if you take someone down in judo and it's not a perfect throw, you do get some time to work on the ground. But what you get on the ground is about 30 seconds to finish the movement, or else they stand you back up.
Oh, I see.
Jiu-jitsu, if you take somebody to the ground in a traditional match, you're on the ground until that person can get up. Now, if you have a giant guy under you, it might take 15 minutes to tire him out. You might have to take him down a couple times to tire him out, but eventually jiu-jitsu will work to reduce that guy's energy bar and to get him to a point where you can apply a choke or an arm lock to him.
I'm glad you brought that up, because the energy bar thing, because that seems to have contributed to UFC 1 as well. That was the era of the fighting game, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat. I talked with a friend of mine last season we were doing Mortal Kombat, the movie. Yeah. And, he made a good point of like, the 90s were that time of pushing boundaries and pushing the envelope, and like games got really, really quick into that category of like pushing boundaries, and people liked it. They liked the conflict. They liked to have, and I think that maybe had to do with the era that we lived in this country of relative peace and prosperity, where we didn't have quite the Gulf War was wrapped up in about a month, like early 1991. And from that point on, and then you get into like the Clinton years, there was some things here and there, but it wasn't like an era of all out war. We enjoy, looking back on it, we're like, oh, the 90s were nice because you didn't have that hanging over us, but we got our conflict fix from our video games. And then that is like, okay, so the people like it at home. Let's make a real life Mortal Kombat, a real life Street Fighter 2, by taking guys from different disciplines and putting them into this new kind of, format with the octagon and all that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it fits so well into, the time period, as far as interest levels and all that. But, when I've watched especially the jujitsu fights and stuff, you're right. There's a lot of time on the ground, and it seems like there's like, to the casual observer, we don't know what's going on. But meanwhile, and I remember watching that with you when we, back in college, early 2000s, you'd explain to me like, okay, what they're doing is actually doing a lot of damage, to the opponent. I'm like, I can't see it, but they're like, just the slightest little, move can do everything, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, that's partly why there was this big event needed to bring jiu-jitsu to the mainstream, because if it was just a jiu-jitsu guy training with a jiu-jitsu guy, that's not going to sell any pay-per-views.
Right.
Jiu-jitsu is not the most fun thing to watch. And I have been doing it, like I said, for a very long time and watching it for even longer. And at the end of the day, what sells is what is kind of, I don't even think it was just about the 90s. I think it's almost just like what's intuitive to human beings to see and understand as violence. Only a few things require very little education for people to know about them. Mm-hmm. Sex is one of them. You don't really need to know much about it in order to, you don't need to be well trained in anything to watch an attractive person of the opposite sex, if you're heterosexual, moving around, and then like you can understand why that's worth watching. Okay. But when it comes to violence, there's a similar aspect to it.
Yeah.
if you see, there's the old cliche where on one corner you're in a city, and on one corner there's a soccer game going on, and on the other corner there's a baseball game going on, and on the third corner there's a fight, and everyone leaves the soccer and baseball game to go watch the fight.
Yeah.
Because there's just something about two primates coming together to be violent against each other's bodies that kind of trips a wire in our amygdala.
Yeah.
It gets us thinking about, I don't know, nature red in tooth and claw. And it, while jujitsu might be kind of this overall solution to the problem of interpersonal one-on-one violence with no rules and time limits, it's not the most fun thing to watch people train in.
Right.
So to see people actually go against each other, to see these expert gigantic punchers and kickers go against this guy who's, 6'1", 170 pounds, kind of unathletic looking, barely looks like he looks like he rolled out of bed. The gi for jiu-jitsu, the uniform, the kimono looks like pajamas. We call it pajama wrestling sometimes. And so you got this skinny looking normal dude in his pajamas wrapping up all these big, muscle heads and kickboxers and scary looking foreign dudes, and putting them into a pretzel in less than a minute. And that's just incredible to people. That's kind of what I think, capture people's imagination.
Yeah.
The subsequent UFCs, people started really training in jiu-jitsu. Like once you hit UFC 2, UFC 3, these people are like, okay, if I'm going to compete against these Gracies, I better know I better know at least a little bit to defend myself on the ground.
Right.
And so from that point on, in a sense, already the water is muddied because you're not seeing any more of the pure art versus art clash that sold the first UFC. Not that was the only thing that sold the first UFC, but it was one of the big things. I also noticed, by the way, I hope to get to this, is that the crew who announced the thing,
Jim Brown,
or how about this? I only learned this today. Do you know who did the post-fight interviews?
Yeah, the guy from Fox News, right?
Brian Kilby.
Yeah,
Is there a weenier guy on TV to have been associated early on with the UFC? I don't think so.
Well, because it seemed like they were having trouble trying to find people to take part because it was, and it's weird because it's not like that. I mean, nowadays it's up there with all other forms of violent entertainment.
But back then it was like
fighting. It was weird, yeah, because I think the way that they pitched it and promoted it, and the audience that they're trying to cultivate, they had people like, I'm not going to touch that. Like, I'm not going to, you're not going to have Bob Costas, like, give it the play-by-play or the background, the story behind it.
The American fascination with martial arts, particularly Kung Fu, Taekwondo, and Karate, hit an apex in the late 80s and early 90s. There were Karate Kid, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Walker Texas Ranger, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Bloodsport, Three Ninjas, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat. The list goes on. All the kicking, punching, and breaking of cinder blocks has become standard components of pop culture. UFC may have had the door kicked open for it to enter into the scene due to these popular films, shows, and video games, but it was certainly not simply an extension of them. If anything, UFC would quickly have those old notions of martial arts in the rear view.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a funny thing because I think they were still looking for their audience, weren't they? It wasn't a ready-made group as there was maybe 10 years later. Now there's other iterations of UFC or other kind of competing, like, because I know that, like, wasn't Pride one that was around? Did that come before or after UFC?
Yeah, Pride never die, man. Pride is, I believe it came before. They were concurrent to each other. So the early UFCs were happening just slightly after the first Prides were occurring. But they were in Japan. They were in a ring. Actually, one of the best early Pride fighters was Hoist Gracie's brother, Rickson Gracie, the one we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The prizes were very much bigger. It was not catered to an American audience. The early ones, I don't even think had English commentary. I could be wrong on that. The very early ones. And so,
didn't we have like a video game of that? Wasn't there a PlayStation
we did,
game?
yeah.
And
we played
like
the Pride
every time you won, like the music would come on. It was like, oh, like they would start like,
oh yeah,
it was like,
oh yeah, you got a memory, bro. Yeah. I don't even, what is that? That might have been PlayStation or something like.
Well, because in that era, I was so like early 2000s, late 90s, I got confused. I'm like, okay, so are they their own separate things, or all just like one big, Pride, UFC, MMA? Like, what goes with what? I was just kind of like overwhelmed by it.
They were confused too. So, there's all these weird rules that went into the turning the UFC from what it was at UFC 1, which is just this clash of barbarians in a cage, with no rules, no time limits. Even the referees had very little to do with anything, right? Eventually, the UFC became a much more legitimate sport with commissions overseeing everything. And now there's even drug testing and all this, right? Early on, the competitors were Pride Fighting Championships and Pancration, both of which were not very popular and certainly not very popular in the United States.
Yeah.
And that's really the novelty of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, is it brought this kind of Eastern question to a Western audience. Because in Japan, they had answered this question already. They knew grappling was very important. Japanese pro wrestling is a little different from American pro wrestling. There's much more wrestling involved in this, much more actual, like amateur style wrestling. And that's true even of our wrestling in this country going back to the 80s and so forth. There was more real engagement between the athletes. But no, so the real novelty here was that the way I think of UFC 1 is it was a commercial for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to show American audiences how badass it was.
Yeah. And
it was a risky commercial because Hoist could have lost. He could have been bludgeoned about the head by one of these large barbarian men.
Yeah.
And and that wouldn't have ended well because he wasn't some giant dude, but they believed in their art and they believed that this man could do it. There is the story from the Gracie family is they chose Hoist Gracie to do this so that people would know you didn't have to be a muscle-bound guy to defeat trained, strong, muscle-bound types.
Yeah.
You could just be a normal dude who knew jiu-jitsu, and then you could wrap these people up,
The whole brute strength component of it seemed to be kind of leaving our culture by that point too, that it wasn't, we talked a few months ago when we did Commando, we were saying how, Schwarzenegger, and this could be seen in the Terminator movies, that after a while, the Panzer tank was no longer, because his very equal, if not better, nemesis that he fights against in Terminator 2 is this sleek looking, skinny guy that is not muscly at all. He just outwits and can do more than his opponent. And by the time you get to the Terminator 3, it's even more so. It's a what they call a Terminatrix, very sexist version of a Terminator. It's like a Terminatrix, can do even more stuff, and it's not anything to do with actual like being big and strong. And it seemed like that was kind of leaving our culture of like, you have to be gigantic. I mean, just look at the comic books too. I mean, there was like the Incredible Hulk, and there was Colossus for the X-Men, and these super muscle bound guys. But by the end of the 90s into the early 2000s, there was plenty of comic book characters, superheroes even, that just looked like ordinary people, and they were just happened to possess some kind of power that made them better than the rest. So I think if they had tried to enter Brazilian jiu-jitsu into the American consciousness 10 years earlier, 1983, it probably would not have caught on. And if they tried to do it 10 years later, it would have just been mixed in with all the other, no pun intended, mixed martial arts stuff,
Yes.
So.
And I agree. And there's this kind of Goldilocks zone they found in the early 90s where people were just primed to experience this in the United States. In the boxing world, in the sports world, everything was becoming much more televised.
Yeah.
Like television was becoming everything. And this pay-per-view format, and honestly, I said it earlier, but I think the idea that you could rent this with your buddies was the thing that really sold it, because people were watching this for years.
Right.
Unlike the most recent heavyweight title fight or the most recent WWF, this was a one of a kind. Or in those first couple of years, a 2 or 3 of a kind event. There was only a couple of these things that American audiences had access to. And so there was something a bit illicit and, forbidden about even accessing this sort of knowledge. Like, we weren't supposed to have seen this, that somebody was allowed to do it. Yeah. And there was something real. I mean, I was born in 84. This came out in 93. So, I was a 10-year-old, 11-year-old renting a video with buddies. Maybe by the time I was doing it, I was 12 or 13. And, we're sitting around watching this and then talking about it for weeks and weeks and weeks and months. And honestly, I'm still talking about it right now. Right. So it's one of those things that sticks in your craw, I think, because it does tickle one of those human boxes in a way that other things just couldn't, because there were so many of them. We were so used to them. And this just had this element of realness those others lacked.
One of the criticisms I remember hearing about that form of entertainment, because it was so many more steps beyond even boxing, as being a pugilist, thing, was that it was like gladiator combat, that it was actually blood sport. People were watching it, but it seems, like you said just a few minutes ago, that it's developed very quickly into having something that just like any other athletic commission would have, that they have some kind of oversight, that there's there are rules but there's no rules, but as far as like off the mat, there's rules for conduct and things like that. Do you think that was the vision back in 1993? Was that something that they were wanting to create, or was that something that came later on to legitimize and to say, no, this isn't just gladiator, this isn't a sign that our culture is crumbling, it's actually a sign that we can do these things but have some kind of legitimacy to it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really long answer to that I can shorten a bit, which is to say that first, Rorion Gracie and the Gracies who put on the first UFC, I really do think their primary reason for doing it, A, yes, they wanted to make money on the event itself, but B, they wanted to bring jiu-jitsu to America so they could open up schools and make money and get out of Brazil and things like that.
Right.
I think I know that basically the reason the UFC became what it became is because the right billionaires got behind it at the right time. The Fertitta brothers were a pair of Vegas billionaires who had, I think, a child. I might be butchering small elements of the story, but they had their friend Dana White from when they were children or something like that. Mm-hmm. And they bought this company that was failing called the UFC. They bought it for like $1 million or something really, really small. And it was failing because they couldn't get it approved anywhere. And so it became the job of these billionaires and their lackey, Dana White, to get it approved by athletic commissions. And to do that, they needed to take all these steps to legitimize it. They needed to have professional refereeing. They needed to have rules that made sense for the safety of the fighters. some of those rules didn't even make sense.
Right.
So there's a rule called the 12 to 6 elbow rule. It's somebody who doesn't watch modern UFC won't know about this, but basically what it means is you can't lift your arm straight in the air and deliver an elbow strike in a straight downwards motion to your opponent. The reason is, as the story goes, because this strike was so powerful that the early commissions wouldn't allow it. And the reason they thought it was so powerful was because they saw people break ice blocks with it. Okay.
Jeez.
Yeah, well, but in other words, it sounds scary, but I mean, is this elbow much worse than a head kick by a 250-pound man to your chin? Like, probably not. Like the elbow. In other words, there's these weird rules still in place, grandfathered in, because early on people were scared to let this thing out at all. So they put all these rules in place, only some of which that made any sense. Yeah, I'd say like the original point of the UFC was to promote Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it succeeded in that regard. The following that, after it succeeded for a little while and then failed and was ready to be sold, it became something designed much more for the masses. And indeed, even things like rounds. So the first UFC wasn't supposed to have rounds. It was supposed to just have unlimited time limit. They added rounds in because of the pay-per-view format, but there were no time limit matches and stuff, and that's just gone now. In fact, even just look at the tournament format. In that first UFC, they fought 3 times in one night.
I know, that's incredible, because the punishment that they take, even the winner, they have to fight with that in
and not
the same
to
day.
mention physical punishment, but also like your adrenaline goes up and then down and then up. And I mean, you can imagine by your 3rd fist fight in one night, no matter how well trained you are, your adrenal glands are tapped out, so to speak, right? Like, so there's all this stuff that they had to change to get it approved. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
They probably had to drink a lot of Mountain Dew in between rounds.
It was all Mountain Dew.
Because it's 1993. Or Surge. They sponsored it. Yeah. Now, we mentioned Street Fighter earlier, and in thinking back to like the cultural analogs, I think that is my number one cultural analog, because what was Street Fighter? You had Dalsim from Thailand. Yeah, he was supposed to be like a yogi Thai boxer kind of guy. You had Sagat, who was a real Thai boxer. You had Ken and Ryu, the American and Japanese karate guys. Vega from Spain. Yeah.
Yeah. Who was Blanca? Blanca was the savage from Brazil.
Brazil, yeah. That was electric somehow.
And it turns out, if you really run this simulation in the real world, who wins Street Fighter? Blanca always does. Yeah. Well, it's funny because it's like when it comes to video games, I'm sure Street Fighter 2 is inspired by this as well, but Mortal Kombat was called that because they wanted to make a video game of Bloodsport, and then they make a video game that Bloodsport, they weren't allowed to take that name, so they just call it Mortal Kombat, and then that turns into a movie in its own right. But in the popularity of those fighting games inspire a real live Bloodsport. It's so funny how it's like a big circle that just kind of keeps like feeding into itself. Big bloody Luke.
Yeah, and it's kind of just wild. So would you say that the current UFC fighters in the last, 10 years or so were probably like you, where they rented the film, rented the VHS from Blockbusters when they were younger, or came across it on YouTube? I know that if you go down a rabbit hole on YouTube, like I have, at like 2 a.m, you're watching MMA guys applying their craft as stopping fights in Wendy's and stuff like that, and at like late nights. You're like, oh, cool. Like, seeing how they can just like, I'm going to knock you unconscious with my hand. And you're like, whoa, some drunk guy going crazy, and then he's like, and then just like 2 seconds later, it's like, and the manager of the restaurant's like, oh, thanks. They're like little superheroes among us. And it's funny.
Yeah. There's the best of those, if you are going to check them out, is when the jiu-jitsu guys get to do it.
Yeah.
Because they're so nice about it, because you don't have to use strikes or real violence at all if you're a jiu-jitsu expert to subdue some moron in a restaurant.
That's what I've seen. Yeah, that's
they're just holding them down and like, come on, relax, buddy. And this is a superpower I'm teaching to my 5-year-old, so that if a bully messes with her,
she can take care of business.
Them down, get full mount, and hold their wrist to the ground and calm them down a little bit.
Yeah. That's the kind of, I remember seeing one where the guy's like in the just like a noodle restaurant or something, and he's like sitting there with his friends, and he's, you know, and there's some guy, just like some drunk guy, just causing a big scene at the, you know, the server's stand or whatever, the what do you call it? Not the maitre d', but you know, the
host,
the hostess station. Yeah. And he just kind of walks over to him. He's like, all right, you know, just so you know, I'm fully trained in jujitsu, and you know, I can take care of it. He just like does a slight little like pressure, you know, and the guy's like, oh, and then he keeps it going. He's like, I'll be back if you know, just so you know. And just like, and so it's like, I'm sure it's possible that he got into that. It's like the Jurassic Park effect, where, you know, if it wasn't for Jurassic Park, there probably wouldn't be so many paleontologists studying in the early 2000s, you know, with dinosaurs, because they see it in the media, they get excited about it. You know, like without Jurassic Park, there's no Ross Geller on Friends who's a paleontologist. He'd be anything else. He'd be an architect. He'd be, you know, or UFC, no UFC, and then Monica's billionaire boyfriend, you know, played by Jon Favreau, would not have competed in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. So Friends is the nexus of the universe, apparently.
Nice, yeah.
I guess where I was going with this is that it's just like, do you think that a lot of the current UFC fighters were like you, where that's where they got the inspiration?
So I'd say, well, I'm an old man now. I'm 38 years old. And so I'd say a lot of the modern fighters were inspired by the second or third generation, even of the UFC. So the early UFCs that were more polished and put together and more akin to the modern sport. Mm-hmm. The people, like, if you go to like George St. Pierre and like 10, 15 years ago, the fighters then, those were people inspired by Royce Gracie and the early guys to get into jiu-jitsu. I'm sure some of the people today would claim they were, but I'd say most of the modern inspiration was from the what I'll call the sport, rather than this early spectacle. There wasn't. It's tough to call UFC one, for all its various monikers. It's tough to call it a sport, because sports involve rules and well-defined competitive structures and so forth. And well, I guess there was a tournament there, but there wasn't really any rules, and the competitors didn't have great knowledge of each other and what the other was bringing to the table. And so in that regard, it was like unique even among the first UFCs, in the fact that, you know, it was less sport-like. Although they did have pretense of being a sport, right? They had Jim Brown.
I was just about to say that. I think that was huge as far as having him there, because then it legitimizes it. And he was actually,
Jim Brown was a serious dude.
And he was the reason why they actually changed rules in lacrosse. He played lacrosse at Syracuse, which is like the birthplace of lacrosse in college, or just in general. And I guess he was notorious for, he would clutch the stick with the ball in it like he would a football, and just charge through it. And they had to change the rules to lacrosse that you can't do that. You have to juggle it, or, you know, away from your body, or pass it. And he was just like scoring endless amounts of goals, because he's like, I'm just going to do what I do in the football field, but just lacrosse. And, you know, that's so, but by him being there, you know, star of the Dirty Dozen, ringside, I'm sure nobody knew how to call what they were watching. They're like, he's pummeling that guy. Yeah.
It was obvious when you listen to them.
Well, and the same thing goes with the referee, because the referee being there also makes it real. It makes it like a correct thing. It's not just a street fight. And I'm glad they didn't add the barbed wire, because then that would have really distracted. But what exactly is the referee in the first UFC even looking for? Like, as if there's no
very
rules,
little, apparently,
just like making sure nobody dies.
I mean, you'd think so, but you know, I think, you know, they were looking at the Chinese food menu, because you look at some of the matches. So in probably the clash of the two best guys in the first tournament, it was Royce Gracie obviously the Brazilian jiu-jitsu guy who won it, versus the so-called shoot fighter, the guy who came over from Pankration from the Japan fights, Ken Shamrock.
Yeah.
Ken Shamrock was not nearly as well versed on the ground as Royce Gracie was, so he lost, although he probably would have beat all the other guys on the ground. And what you saw when those two went at it, they came together. Royce Gracie shoots a takedown. Ken Shamrock sprawls and gets on top eventually, and Royce finally sweeps and gets on top of Ken. Ken turns his back. Royce applies a chokehold using his uniform. So in jiu-jitsu, you can often choke your opponent using the gi or the kimono itself. There's a number of them. The one that Royce used, he grabbed his own sleeve on one side of the neck, and his arm was going around the other side of the neck, and he was choking him like this.
Yeah.
And Ken is sitting there slapping the ground, tapping out, and the ref's sitting there.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, he's like, just
yeah.
like,
He's got no idea what he's looking at, in other words.
he's like, that's what you mean by tap.
Exactly. Yeah, right.
What you're talking about.
He probably, to his credit, didn't recognize that this was a position in which the fight could end. And that's kind of the point of UFC 1 is on the ground, there's all these positions that just look like one guy's laying on top of the other. But in fact, in that position, there's force being applied to end the fight in a rather quick period of time. And that's exactly what happened. In those gi chokes, if you get caught with somebody choking you with their gi, there's some of the quickest chokes that come on. You can go to sleep in a couple of seconds, man.
Yeah.
So Ken's slapping the ground, and the ref's just like, huh? and it turned out Ken had to be a sportsman and say, no, I tapped out, because the ref that didn't see it at all. They could have continued that fight. So cheers to Ken Shamrock.
It's like an extreme version of when I used to love American Gladiators. I would watch all the new ones and the reruns, on USA Network. And it was, and I think it fit the same, kind of need that we were all looking for. But even as a kid, I used to crack up at the ref, because it's like he's making up motions for things that only apply. It's not like, everyone knows, both in basketball and, like the symbol for 3-pointer is the same for field goal, and pretty much every sport is the two arms up in the air, whereas this guy would be like, okay, here's the motion for, illegal rolling of the giant gerbil ball into the wrong, he'd be like doing like, and I think he made him up on the spot.
Yeah.
But again, they had that guy there, and he wore the traditional, black and white striped referee shirt to indicate this is not just a goofy show. This is we're trying to make real sports here. I would love to see them, play those sports beyond American Gladiator one day, the swinging off vines and stuff like that into
joust.
The joust.
Gemini was the king of the joust.
What was the name of the final thing? Was it the Eliminator or the
Eliminator? I think that sounds right.
The tennis,
like that.
I used to love the tennis ball, or there was the shooting one where they had to hide behind. There was like this shirtless guy with a giant tennis ball shooter.
As if these meatheads are like snipers with this tennis ball gun. Yeah. Like it could be anybody up there.
But like none of that carried over into anything beyond that studio that they filmed it all in. Whereas the UFC clearly did have applications beyond there, because that's where these guys were coming from to do it all. So I think the last question I have for you, because I think we've covered it all pretty well, but was it, so you're saying it was a little bit of combination of both prescriptive and descriptive, in that it was describing to an audience that had never really seen it, had no way to see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, this is what it is, without coming out and saying it, but also prescribing a new form of ring fighting.
Absolutely. That's a really good way to put it. I think the fact that they made it descriptive in style might be one of the big reasons it caught on. If this was a show that was called the Ultimate Jiu-Jitsu Championship,
right,
and they just had a jiu-jitsu guy beating these other styles, I don't think it would have caught on as much. But because these other styles got to fight each other as well, and it just seemed like a normal tournament, and the natural winner of it was jujitsu. I think that's what made this really, really catch on. And it did. It prescribed a new style of fighting, or rather a new style of competition that people could hang their hat on. It didn't do it right away, and it didn't do it perfectly at first, but it showed that there was an appetite for something beyond the sweet science of boxing, something a bit more real. Or not to say boxing isn't real, but let's say something a bit more realistic,
almost like organic in a way.
Organic, because the old, and I don't know how true this actual statistic is, but the old adage to get people into ground fighting is 90% of all one-on-one fights end up in a grappling exchange. Like if you see cops arrest people, or you see people in a bar. Right. Almost all these fights are rarely two people standing up with their hands in good position, throwing combinations, slipping and moving. Usually, even when it's all stand-up fight, someone's grabbing a shirt and it looks more like a hockey fight.
Right.
And it looks like
it's dirty. It's not like a, it's not a traditional fist fight with fisticuffsmanship in there,
Right. Well, and jujitsu, what jujitsu offers you, if you study it, and this is, this came out more and more as people became more acquainted with it. It offers you an alternative that doesn't require much athleticism, and it turns into jujitsu is the art of grabbing somebody's shirt and stopping them from hurting you. Mm-hmm. Because if somebody wants to hurt you, they're going to close the distance. They're going to come in contact with you, and they're going to swing their limbs at you, whether it's punches, kicks, headbutts, whatever. Jiu-jitsu is the art of when that happens, of maintaining your safety, so self-defense, and neutralizing the opponent. And that's something that a lot of people really were after in the early 90s.
I remember seeing it, I remember seeing it as a kid, and fights breaking out, and I remember one time this kid got into the karate stance and everyone just busted out laughing because it looked so silly. The other kid was just he was just going to come at him, with, whatever he throws, and everyone just started cracking up and I'm like, unless it's like that Jim Carrey, Living Color skit where it's unless the move is exactly the way you want it, you can't do much with it. But jiu-jitsu, it's you don't even have to indicate that it. It's not like you could, and it's almost like an in disguise kind of martial art where it's.
No, and you said it really well. In karate, it works best, and especially in things like taekwondo, or especially something like aikido, which is the biggest joke of all of them, which is if you don't have a cooperating opponent, you can't do aikido. Steven Seagal can walk in a circle and flip all these people using these small joint lock manipulations. And you know why he can do it? It's because he's a famous guy who found these people who are willing to cooperate with him and put on a show. If Steven Seagal walks into a Brazilian jiu-jitsu gym anywhere in the world, there's, 20 blue belts there who've been training for a year who could wrap him up like a pretzel just because they're not willing to agree to be flipped around by their wrists. And that really is, it's as simple as that. And back in the day, there was this proliferation of the McDojo, as it's called, which is to say these dojos that sprout up like McDonald's, where, bring your kid in and he'll get a black belt in 6 months. You just have to pay all these fees, and there's a fee for each test. And there's all these honorifics and these pictures on the wall. I remember I worked one time for karate. I worked for about 2 hours for this karate place when I was a teenager. And I had to dress as a Power Ranger in the sweltering heat in front of a Toys R Us, which was next to the karate place.
Right.
And you walked in there and you'd think this guy was Liu Kang, from Mortal Kombat, because he had pictures of himself everywhere glistening with body oil, and there was mirrors all around so he could presumably watch himself while he's kicking the air. If that guy, again, I don't know who this guy is, presumably he's dead now, but if we were to walk into any jiu-jitsu school, he's going to get grabbed a hold of by his parka, and he's going to get dragged to the mat in an ugly kind of way, and he's going to get wrapped up again. And unless you know grappling arts, that's going to happen to just about everybody.
Yeah.
So
no, that's a perfect way to wrap it up, because it is exactly that. It was just like so much else in that time period. It was modernity taking on the traditional and winning, because it was like, these things just don't happen naturally, but our kind of fighting does. So thank you, Professor Dan Hipp, for joining me on the EPS podcast to talk about UFC 1 and I think Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kind of together as a primary source. So we'll have to have you on again soon. This is so much fun, because it's like, 20 years ago when we were in college, we like
same conversations, bro.
One day we're going to do this non-existent thing called a podcast, and it's going to be about this video game, and these shows that we're going to watch. I remember watching those Gracie instructional videos in the common room.
Oh yeah.
So that's like it all comes full circle.
Absolutely. Hey, it's great speaking to you, and I'm happy to come back next season as your violence correspondent.
Of course, we'll pick something else, maybe Power Rangers.
Right. That'd be awesome. Okay, man. I'll talk to you later.
Take care, everyone.
You're listening to Season 2 of the EPS Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Full-length episodes like this one are being delivered on Thursdays, while shorter episodes, the products of my EPS Podcast live exhibits, come out on Tuesdays. If you like what you hear, consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS podcast. There you'll be able to select from several different tiers, which will offer you such gifts as stickers, mugs, and t-shirts, depending on which level you become a patron at. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube, and especially on Instagram. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source.